Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on employment matters within charities. This webinar is a collaboration between the Law Society Pro Bono Services and the Singapore Corporate Counsel Association Pro Bono Chapter. My name is Sarita Misser, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Before we begin, just some housekeeping matters. Feel free to ask questions at any time during this webinar using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address your questions during or at the end of the talk. There will also be a QR code featured on the top left-hand corner of the slides for you to access the handouts for today's webinar. A link will also be made available to you during the follow-up email sent tomorrow. Please note that the discussion and any material provided in this webinar is not intended to constitute or substitute for professional legal advice. You should always consult a lawyer if you require specific legal advice. Okay, with that done, let me introduce our speakers for today. On our panel today, we have Ng Joo Kin and Joyce Lake. Welcome, Joo Kin and Joyce. Joo Kin was called to the Singapore Bar in 1990 and has been active in many of Singapore's largest and most innovative transactions in recent years. He is consistently recognized by legal publications as a leading corporate and capital markets practitioner. His clients have described him as a highly trusted advisor and also praised him for his very strategic advice and guidance. Joyce is currently the Deputy Director of Strategic Leadership, Sunway and Boards at the NCSS. A seasoned HR leader with close to 20 years of experience in the public service, Joyce has experience in the full spectrum of HR and specializes in employee experience, talent management, leadership development, business partnering, HR transformation, and organization development. On top of her deep knowledge in HR, Joyce is also experienced in managing large-scale events such as the World Cities Summit in 2008, as well as speakers and VIP management. Joyce, Joo Kin, welcome again, and thank you for joining us. So why don't we just begin straight away with the I think the most pressing matter that we have across the board, not just for charities and NPOs, but also the private sector as well, which is talent attraction, retention, and development. Especially in today's work environment, charities and NPOs have not been spared this problem either. Joo Kin, maybe you can start us off with some pointers on these issues for charities and NPOs.
Certainly, Sarita. Thanks everyone for joining this session. We hope that we can actually address some of the big picture items and some of the questions that we received over the last week or so. And feel free, please, to just send in your Q&A. I will try to address as much as I can, but well, certainly I would like to actually address it in a deeper manner when we get to the Q&A section. Now, I think one of the biggest challenge that any charity, any NPO would face is this word called financial constraint, or this phrase called financial constraint. Now, basically, unlike a commercial for-profit organization where you could justify spending by showing that you have improved the earnings for the stakeholders, a charity or a non-profit organization largely depend a lot on the donations that come to them, as well as the grants that were given to them from time to time. So one of the biggest, I guess, question that anybody in the HR department would ask is that how much is too much, or how much is just right to spend? I think they need to be accountable to funders and actually the need to make sure that there is actually sufficient transparency as to how you spend the donors' money, the grants that have been given to you. It is very important because it also spells the level of confidence that future donors, future grantors will continue to support your organization. Well, your HR colleagues will often find themselves having to justify spending on systems or on people-related initiatives. Of course, best systems, best people is actually a dream for everybody. Now, be it job advertisement, be it new initiatives or training, what is natural spending may not, in fact, and likely not to be regarded as natural for a charity or a non-profit organization. You know, one common outcome of this is that there is always an issue of multi-hatting by staff. So you'll find the CEO also becoming a HR manager or HR department head. And you know, the implications of having multi-hatting by the staff would be things like potential for conflict of interest situations. You have ability and competency issues. Is the CEO the best man for the HR role? And what about competing demands? If you have actually one person doubling up both as CEO and HR manager for the organization, and when there's a competing demand for his time, what would actually take precedence? Going out to see donors or taking care of the staff, who is almost at the brink of quitting? Well, in a world that demands work-life balance, this is even worse, because then how do we justify to a staff who is multi-hatting and doing so many roles and not having a proper work-life balance? And that will actually have implications on the people that will join your organization. Another aspect, of course, is employment practices. Now, the good thing is that we do have very good guidelines. In fact, you go to the MOM website, you get a lot of resources there to actually give guidance as to how to place advertisements, to make sure that applications for jobs are fairly treated, robustly sieved through. How do you conduct job interviews? What are the guidelines that you should give to your staff when they join your organization? So go into the Ministry of Manpower's website. It's just a treasure trove of very important and very key guidelines. In fact, you know, the Tripartite Alliance for Fair and Progressive Practices, TAFAP in short, they've produced so many standards and so many guidelines that it is amazing. In fact, anybody who wants to set up a charity ought to go to that website first before even proceeding. Things like diversity, inclusion, they are getting very, very common, and the expectation, even more so for a charity and a nonprofit organization, the expectation is that there should be focus on diversity and inclusion. Of course, fair employment, fair dealing, all this will all come in. What about the aspect of the contracts that you sign with your staff, the employment contracts? Now, in a situation where you're constrained in terms of funding, do you actually do everything in-house? Go to Google, get a template, just try to do up as a format as much as as extensive and as comprehensive as you can imagine without going to a legal professional to give you some guidance? Well, it might be possible, but it is always safe to at least make sure that your initial drafts are being vetted by a professional. Now, it is actually also a good practice to try to standardize some of your employment contracts, because the more variation you have, the more confusing it gets after a while, especially when your staff strength is actually rather big. What about benefits? How do you attract the best talents? What is actually the charity looking for? What kind of people would you want to be your staff, to be your volunteers? And whilst a charity needs to be prudent and responsible for the use of funds, but it does not mean that people who are working in a charity must necessarily take less or a lot less than people working in a commercial setup. The last point probably I would like to touch on very briefly is actually on the professional indemnity and directors and officers insurance. Now, in the past, maybe you talk about 15 years ago, people hardly talk about taking up professional indemnity and directors and officers for charities, because they would just say that, well, why would a charity be sued? But in today's world, this is actually very important. It's a necessary evil. It gives also some comfort to your board members, to your committee members, and even to your CEO and key management staff, because they are all liable to be exposed to suit, complaints, and even legal action for things that they're doing out of probably sometimes ignorance, but out of good faith. Well, whereas one might expect that there's a natural resistance in people to want to take up legal suits against charitable organizations. In fact, if you look into the newspapers and you look into, especially not so much in Singapore, but certainly in certain countries, it is not unusual for charitable organization to be sued. Sarita.
Thank you, Joaquin. All very important issues for sure. Joyce, let's move on to you then. From an HR background, especially in the social services sector, can you tell us some of the factors, both externally and internally in the sector itself, that might impact the kind of talent strategy for charities and NPOs?
Thank you, Sarita, and hello to everyone. And special thanks to LawSoc for this speaking opportunity to share my personal HR perspectives. I'd like to begin by saying that actually non-profit is not very different from for-profit. In fact, the charity conference which I attended last week, when asked, what is the biggest challenges, that the board and the CEO face today, many of them highlighted, talent attraction, retention, and succession planning are some of the biggest challenges that they face. So I want to actually take the chance to cover some of these aspects later on as I speak. We live in a VUCA world, today, and when COVID hit us, right, it hit us without warning, and it accelerated many of the unprecedented changes to our lives at home and also at work. Remote working and digitalization has fortunately or unfortunately become a new workplace norm. Some even joke, who is the key driver of change? Actually, COVID. Fortunately for my team, we were fully digital, even before COVID comes, and we were already practicing, work from home arrangements for some days of our work. So it wasn't very difficult for us to adjust to the new normal. And earlier this year, we also launched AI chatbot for the recruitment to create better candidate experience. And we actually saw a 75% time savings. So what happened is we actually changed the job of this particular staff who was our main recruiter. And she could actually use her time to do higher order work and having a better development and better experience herself. So some people then ask, using machines, will that compromise our candidate quality? Actually, no. Actually, we continue to sustain high quality candidates, and many of them actually almost 100% success in the final panel interview that we put them through. So COVID will be here for a long haul. In the new endemic world, right, returning to office 100% is going to be a wishful thinking. How is your organization building a culture of trust, creating this safety and healthy hybrid work arrangement? The other point I want to also go into is, I don't know whether anyone realized that actually now there are 4 generations in your workplace, right? The baby boomers, the Gen X, Y, and the Zers are out last year. The Gen Z, they probably scan their future employers, on Glassdoor even before they apply for the job. They look beyond traditional factors like pay and progression. They look for, is your company, is your organization tech-friendly? Do you have strong leadership and organization culture? Do you have diversity, equity, and inclusion? In the 2020 Insights report done by the Great Place to Work, which is a global certification, there are actually 5 key factors that will distinguish your workplace from good to great. Trust-based, agile culture, inclusive leadership, holistic wellness, and embrace humanity. So I challenge you to think about, what is your organization brand? COVID is not at all, not all bad. There are some good aspects as well. It has kind of reshaped the in-demand skills such as crisis management, critical and analytical thinking, machine learning, tech, resilience, and agility. How are you buying these talents? Or if you are not buying, how are you training your people to have such skills? Several of the booming industries we see today are like the e-commerce, the tech, the healthcare. They are paying big bucks to attract talents. Social service sector is facing steep competition for talents. Without high pay, what is your unique selling point to attract and to retain? Now, bringing the lens back to our own world, the non-profit world. What is the demographics? Majority of our workforce, women, 50% of the workforce are below the age of 40, and majority of the leavers are also women. So I ask you, do you know why they leave? Do you have family friendly, HR people policies? There is also an influx of new hires below the age of 30. What makes them join you? What do they look for when they join you? There is talent mobility in the sector. Why do they leave? Where do they go to? Is it due to bad relationship with the boss, job growth, or career progression? Are you using volunteers to augment your manpower shortage? What are some of these trends that speak to you as leaders, as HR leaders in a nonprofit space? Leaders and HR will need to ask the right questions and use data for decision making to design your people policies and practices. I'll end here, Sharita.
Thank you so much, Joyce. I think it's a great segue for us to then talk about the next part of talent attraction and retention. And it's really about development, right? Training and development. So we all know in today's economy, we have talked about skills-based economy, we have talked about reskilling, upskilling, being future ready. So obviously charities and NPOs are not spared from this. You also need to upskill and develop your people, right? So, but the issue with this is that charities and NPOs sometimes are not so willing to send their staff for training for various reasons, right? Not just monetary reasons. And also, I think on the flip side, there's no guarantee that the employees who are then sent for training, complete their training, will actually stay on, right? For enough of a period to recoup the cost, I think, to speak it that way, right? So what this means is that there seems to be a double whammy then for charities and NPOs, right? It's the monetary cost, the training fees that you pay, and then on top of that, you have the talent drain or the brain drain, right? And then the cycle continues, right? You get the next person in, you train them, they leave. Get the next person in, train them, they leave, right? So to deal with this, what we have seen is that some of the NPOs and charities, right, when they tend to impose a bond or some kind of clawback, right, clawback mechanism for their staff that they send for training, if they leave for a certain, if they leave after the training, right? So maybe let's start with you, Jukin. Can you tell us maybe some of the legal considerations, right, when it comes to imposing this kind of bonds or imposing this kind of monetary clawbacks on employees?
It's a tricky question. In fact, there is no set answer for that. For example, if you're talking about a training bond, would a 6-month period be too long? Will it be 4 years? That will be too long. Scholarships, very generally, after they send someone on a scholarship training for their university degree, they're bound for 3 to 6 years. Then the question is that, how much do you claw back? Do you claw back 100% if they breach 1 day of the training bond period? Do you claw back pro rata? Well, for a start, whatever the training bonds and clawbacks might be, they have to be fair and reasonable. No court is going to assist an organization, whether you're a charity or not, to enforce unethical, unfair penalties and clawbacks, especially if it basically causes hardship, undue hardship to the employee. Generally, clawbacks must be seen as a compensation and not a penalty. So just remember those two words, compensation versus penalty. I'm not sure whether you'll be surprised by this, but actually in today's context, when we talk about whether something is fair or not fair, as a clawback, for example, we are actually still looking at a case that was decided more than a century ago. So it is sometime back in the 1900s, the beginning of 1900s, there's this case called Dunlop Pneumatic Tire Company versus New Garage and Motor Company. And if, in fact, the decision inside there has been used and repeated and adopted in 2015 by a Singapore case. The key phrase that the court has decided to write on to determine whether something is actually fair or not fair to be clawed back is actually genuine pre-estimate the loss flowing from the breach of the contract. Well, in today's context, in today's layman term, I would use the word disproportionate. whether what we are trying to do or what the organization is trying to do in the clawback amount is seen to be disproportionate to the harm that actually has been caused or been suffered by the organization. So for sure, if the bond period for an employee sends for a locally held training at a cost that is multiple times lesser than the cost of sending an employee overseas, you can't expect the bond period to be the same. Otherwise, it will create a question of whether it's fair, whether it's reasonable. A provision that says that an employee cannot resign during the bond period, no matter how much you have spent on that employee, is not likely to be enforced by the court. So in other words, even if you say that there's a bond period, the best and the most that the court will do is to try to see whether the amount of compensation, the amount of damages that you are claiming would justify, the shortened period that the employee is serving. So, back to the same, just now, one point I raised. If let's say the bond period is for 100 days, and the employee has already served 99 days out of 100, surely the court will not endorse a clawback of 100%, because it has to take into consideration that the employee actually has reasonably served out his most of his bond period, right? So I think a very important point to note is that whatever the training bond period is, whatever the clawback may be, your organization needs to be very transparent and must ensure that the employee is fully aware of what he's signing on. There's no point giving him a blank sheet of paper, make him sign on the dotted line, and then you add on all the clauses later on for him to claim that he doesn't know what he's signing or he doesn't really understand what he's signing. Well, my personal view is that anything that has such provisions, and if the provisions are not clear, the court is likely to rule against the organization rather than an individual. It is also really prudent for an organization to give reasonable time for the employee to consider and in fact encourage him or her to seek legal counsel advice or to actually check around before they sign on the dotted line. There's no point trying to force somebody to sign with little time to think about, because that will only backfire for the organization. In fact, an employee's defense against an employment bond claim, whether it's for a monetary claim or that he must serve out a longer period, would include things like misrepresentation by the organization. Has the employee actually signed the contract under duress or coercion? Or simply that when he signed, he could prove that he didn't really understand what he's signing. Well, then those are actually basis for the employee to try to defend against any claim against him for a clawback. All said, while training bonds and clawbacks do often have the deterrent effect, but the question is whether these are the best tools that an organization can use. Are there better ways of trying to retain a staff rather than to give him the stick?
Thank you, Joaquin. Maybe Joyce, let's move on to you then. I think following on from Joaquin's last point, right, about instead of imposing this kind of penalty or restraint or restrictions, right, as a reactive measure, why don't we talk about proactively, right? What are the considerations or best practices, right, for charities and NPOs when you're thinking about sending your staff for training and development in the first place?
Thank you, Sharita. So my point is, how can you be a more charming employer, right? Instead of using bond terms and all to jail the people and to keep them longer. So earlier on in my speech, I kind of mentioned about, you have to create your own employer brand, and then you have to select the right people. Then once they are on board, right, how do you then create an environment to help your people to be successful? Do you have an encouragement of staff to have the growth mindset and the learning agility? I think investing in people is very key. So when I talk about investment in people, I look at two aspects. One is your rank and file. Are you giving them and equipping them with core competencies? The other bucket that I look for is always the high potentials and the appointed leaders. Are you focusing on leadership competencies? Do you identify your high potential early? Do the leaders know actually how to build that culture of trust, how to do active listening and communication with the people? I think more companies today are actually focusing, on, more companies are actually seeing the connection, right, of people performance and business performance. Attract and retain are no longer just the HR's business. Leaders really need to know how, to do HR, to coach, to inspire, to groom, and to engage. Leaders are also involved in HR decision making. You take care of the people, and the people take care of the service outcomes for you. And this is so true in the social service sector. As leaders, how are you building the culture of trust? So coincidentally, a few nights ago, I was reading an article. It is titled 7 Phrases Every Leader Should Say More to Convey Gratitude, Vulnerability, and Trust. Your words and the impact and your actions will have profound impact on the team that you lead, whether is it verbally or on emails, whether is it meeting rooms, or now we have Zoom rooms, right? So are you creating this psychological safety in your workplace where everyone has a voice? In my course of work, I speak to a lot of leaders from the 3P sectors. Some of the SSAs are also winners of Employer of Choice, SHRI Award, certified Great Place to Work. What is their secret sauce? One common observation is that the leaders and the HR, they focus on hire people that are aligned with their mission, with their values. The passion to serve, particularly for a certain social cause, is so important. Even if you cannot pay, right, you have a robust structure to engage, to groom, to develop. You have a system that is fair and transparent reward system. And you also create an enriching human experience while they are with you. These agencies and companies, they are perfectly fine when staff leave them. When they eventually leave, it is for better progression. However, what the companies know also is that they have done their part in developing next generation leaders for the sector. This brings me very nicely into talking about succession planning. It is important that leaders and HR identify your key positions early. Who are your successors? So that you have sufficient runway to prepare them for the bigger assignment. Will they be 1 to 2 years ready or 3 to 5 years ready? You have to ask yourself such questions, and you create scenarios, all right, and the environment and all the elements to prepare them for that big job. For example, you may want to rotate them to different functions. You have tested them out on strategic roles. You have tested them out on operations, running operations, right? Do they have the leadership exposures within the organizations or outside the organization? Have you given them a coach or a mentor? Have you tested them out? If your agency is small, maybe it's very difficult for you to offer such exposure and progression. So what should you do? I think you need to think out of the box and be very willing to collaborate with other SSAs. For example, to offer talent attachment program, secondments. Are you willing to consider the Sunray scheme as well? Many have approached me over the years to also share with me that they have such challenges, and even if one day they want to promote someone to a CEO level, will they be ready to take the job? Right, so they put them through our Sunray assessment system, where we actually will take them after a few stints. The Sunrays can return to this mothership to helm actually larger leadership positions. For those who are keen to find out more, I've actually asked LawSoc to help me circulate a deck of resources that NCSS has and for the SSAs to tap on. Most of you would also be familiar with SSI, right? Our training arm for the social service sector. And they have heavily subsidized courses that are very much aligned with Skills Future Framework. So back to you, Sarita.
Thank you, Joyce. We have one of the questions here about what are the 7 phrases that you were talking about for leaders?
Okay, the 7 phrases are, there are, appreciation. Do you thank people enough? And when you thank, is it just like a thank you? Or do you bother to explain what are you particularly thankful of? do you show your vulnerability? If the leaders is able to acknowledge that, it's okay not to be okay, especially sometimes leaders are also overwhelmed, be prepared to come forward to share, that you are also stressed, you don't have a solution, and be prepared to show your vulnerability. I think staff will appreciate you. In fact, on this point, right, I'm a follower of BBS on LinkedIn, and I do actually, see what the leaders do for the workforce. So I think Piyush and Kai, who is actually one of the board member, actually stood up recently to engage the staff on this whole notion of mental wellness in the organization. They came forward to share. They themselves experience, anxiety issues and how they overcome it. I think it speaks a lot when the top leaders are prepared to come in, to share their own struggles. Staff will also feel assured that it's okay for them not to be okay. It's okay that there is a psychological, safety environment to come forward to share their challenges and will not be stigmatized that they are, a weaker performer, etc. So I think creating such environment and using the right phrases are very important for every leaders. Have we lost our moderator?
So I will
think
step in. So Sarita has been dropped out. So I will continue. Maybe we can move on to the other important issue of how to manage complaints and grievances and conduct investigation. So we will now look. So Jukin, can you start us out with some guidelines on what charities and NPO should have to deal with when it comes to this kind of issues?
Certainly. Okay. Well, I think when we talk about grievances, is wrapped up in many. It's actually there are different aspects of it, and a grievance could be about the employee. A grievance could be it could be something that is caused internally, and it could be something that is caused externally. Now, I would start off by saying that again, please make use of the guidelines that have been given by TAFEP. They have a very good set of what they call good grievance handling practices, and they give you the standards. What would actually suffice for grievance handling? One of the things that you should always ensure is that you put in place appropriate policies and provide training. It's just not about writing, a long list of do's and don'ts and what they can do to protect themselves and what they ought not to do when they're dealing with their subordinates or even, when dealing with external parties, the volunteers. It is important that everyone within the organization, including the volunteers, because they are actually very much part of your HR personnel. And we need to actually train them to make sure that based on their roles, they know what are the avenues that they could look to resolve things which are not happy about, because their behavior, the level and the extent that you can address their grievances would translate into better service for the beneficiaries of the charities. Now, there is a need to make sure that it's written in clear and succinct manner. No point using flowery language or trying to use legal jargon to try to mask some of these do's and don'ts, some of these guidelines. You have to make them available and easily accessible. So of course, the recommendation always is that within your own intranet, if you have one, always make them available, always update them. Put up posters suitably placed in the office premises to remind employees that they do have a place to go to when they're not happy, and they do not need to go outside the organization in the first instance to try to get things addressed, right? And also, very importantly, is to make sure that you create an environment where that you're able to tell them and assure them that whatever complaints they may have, whatever grievance that they may bring up to the higher level, it will be addressed and investigated if necessary in confidence. I think that the word confidence is very important. Now, implementing a reporting and response procedures, whistleblowing in short, is also very critical. We have to encourage staff to report bad behaviors and making sure that safe, confidential, clear avenues exist for them to do so. Of course, reporting lines and channels, both within and outside of the organization, you just have to draw that very clearly. You know, one of the biggest challenges is that if your CEO is also the HR manager, then where do you go if the CEO is the troublemaker or is the person that is causing the grievance? Well, then I think, you know, parties outside of the executive team, for example, board members, committee members, ought to be roped in, or in fact make available for staff to approach directly. There must be an assurance that there will be no retaliation after the report is made. So therefore, you know, how it's being handled, who is the one that is handling the investigations would be very important. Now, the way that the investigation procedures are put in place would also be important. I mean, you need to have robust procedures for it. Number one, keep the identities and the informants confidential. I think the last thing I want is that when I talk about something to someone and then everybody know the next minute will actually know that I'm the one who actually make the complaint. Appoint trained neutral parties to investigate. What if there's a conflict of interest due to multi-hatting of roles, like the CEO being also the HR manager? Who will be the ombudsman? This is a challenge for an organization that is not well staffed, but there's always the board or committee members, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, sometimes you may also need to seek the help of the external parties for very extensive investigations or investigations that require more than just, you know, a questionnaire being given out to the so-called victimized, or just a simple interview where there will be need to look into evidence, into, you know, all the documents that are being exchanged. Maybe you could actually ask for help from external parties like lawyers who volunteer with the Law Society Pro Bono Services. Evaluate the case based on available evidence. It is important that the organization must be seen to be fair and reasonable, and it has to be based on evidence. It cannot just be hearsay. In fact, you know, there's a need also sometimes to provide progress updates and findings to all parties, not just to only the party that is aggrieved or to the parties that is actually complained against. But in doing so, we have to be very careful not to compromise the integrity of the investigations that actually that are being undertaken. In fact, if there's a need to take corrective actions, the organization need to show that they are ready and they are prompt in taking those actions. From a legal perspective, it is critical for the organization to ensure that the principles of natural justice are applied. And, you know, the organization should also ensure that it has sufficient evidence to show that it actually abides by the principles of natural justice. Now, what is natural justice? Basically, two principles. One, the rule against bias. So it can be actual bias or it could be imputed bias. When we say actual bias, it is fact-based. It is where a decision maker is shown to be prejudiced in favor of or in fact against a party. So it can be either way. Right? And this party could be the aggressor or it could be the aggrieved. But in practice, really, it is very difficult to prove. And sometimes it's difficult even for the aggrieved to actually say it out or even express exactly what had been done or said. Imputed bias will be actually more obvious form. It's actually easier to establish sometimes. It is the obvious form of, example of the obvious form of imputed bias is where the decision maker is already in a conflict of interest position. Back to the same example, a CEO who has actually offended or harassed somebody in the office is also the HR manager. He can't be asked to do the investigation. Well, maybe he may not be the one that is directly involved, but if he has a personal interest, for example, the aggressor is his close relative, then he is not the right person to address the problem. Any reasonable suspicion of bias or where there's a real likelihood of bias, these are things which the court of law will look out for and will apply. So the second principle of natural justice is really the right of fair hearing. This includes actually ensuring that adequate notice is served on the person being complained against or investigated against. You can't try to investigate something without telling the person who is being complained against. You need to give that person the full picture of what is being complained against, and to allow the person to actually express his side of the story, not just the victim, but the so-called aggressor. The hearing must also be evidence-based. It should not just be hearsay, as mentioned earlier. And very important, fair opportunity to answer to any allegations, as well as a fair opportunity for the person to present his or her case. So if you were to deprive the aggressor from answering to any allegations, that is not natural justice. On the other hand, if you stop a victim from saying too much because you just don't want to hear too many complaints, that itself is also not natural justice. So these are important points that we need to take note of, and to ensure that we have a robust system where we weed out any unfair treatment, any unreasonable behavior, any harassment at the workplace.
Thank you, Joaquin. Thank you for that. Joyce, maybe from your perspective, can you tell us some tips in terms of how to manage workplace grievances, workplace investigations?
I want to first say that, it's a good thing if your HR don't have many of such cases. If it's plentiful, then I guess you're not hiring the right profile of people into your organization. And I also like this new phrase that I picked up from Joaquin, the aggressor and the agree. So today I learned 2 new terms. It is important, really, like what you have said, to have a fair and transparent process where everyone, is not just watching how you actually handle the case professionally, not just the affected people, but also, when you mention about, is the employer, willing to make changes, to change the system, because something is obviously not right somewhere. So this one can actually affect your employer brand. Always be prepared to hear 2 sides of the stories, giving the victim, being accused, a fair chance to explain their side of the stories, recognizing that really it can be a very traumatic experience. So what HR should also take care of is really their mental health. We can actually offer professional counseling. So the point is, don't treat people like a criminal yet. Respect the course of investigation. If need be, have independent teams to support the investigation, one to cover the complainant and the other one to cover the person who is being complained, for a fairer evaluation. From a panel inquiry, most often is chaired by the CEO, and then there will be people in the panel like Director HR and an independent party, usually from the audit com, to avoid conflict of interest. Depending on the outcome of the evaluation, the CEO, upon consulting with the chairman, can then decide whether to refer this case to the police or to close the case if it is quite obvious that it is a case of misunderstanding. And then you must close the loop back, to the complainant on the outcome of the investigation. For very sensitive matter involving the police, our advice is always, the HR director to take the lead in driving the process under your belt. The chairman and the comms director, should also be involved early stage, especially if you anticipate media exposure or that you actually need to prepare a PR response in advance. If the complaint concerns a CEO, like what Joaquin has mentioned earlier on, then he is actually not the best person to drive the process. Perhaps you may need, the board to support you. HR or audit, committee might have to drive the process instead.
Thanks, Joyce. I think we have some questions that are pertinent to the role of the board, which is fantastic because that's the next section that we're going to be talking about. So let's then touch briefly then on the role and responsibilities of the board when it comes to employment matters. What is the relationship between board, management, HR, in charities and NPOs? Joyce, can you take us through this?
Sure. To speak the very least, I think an effective board provides a strategic guidance to the management team, really not dabbling into the operational functions. It is very important to have clarity of the roles of what the board should do and what the management should do. The board too also have to influence at very strategic level on HR management, have a succession plan for the board in place, and also think about what contributes to the SSA's future readiness. So there are many roles. If you look at the CNPL's handbook on effective non-profit boards, right? I think there are easily 8 factors, and there are a lot of parameters that you can also, get a hand in understanding what specific roles are you referring to. Otherwise, SID actually offers very good program like SYN. SYN is actually for board members who are first time in the sector and want to know actually what's the difference between corporate and non-corporate board, right? Is the topic is called So You Want to Be a Non-Profit Director. Yeah, so subscribe to this program. There's another program called S Good that has very robust 7 modules. It brings you through, the governance, liability, and many other aspects of what a board member should know. And the best part is NCSS actually subsidize such programs. So, come to us if you need any of this support. We'll be more than happy to assist you. So the next point is actually gone were the days that HR merely performs transactional functions. So is your HR equipped with multifaceted role? Or is the CEO, doubling up like what Jukin mentioned as a HR director as well in your SSA? And if so, actually a competent board is very important to complement the skills where the management is lacking to provide that strategic guidance. Many of the SSAs have at least about 4 subcommittees. So the HR, the finance, audit, investment. And I'm actually seeing a trend that, board are also inviting board members with a strong IT background as we talk about digitalization in the sector. So how are you leveraging on your board to augment where you are not today is very important. You may not know where your gaps are. So my advice to you is board, if you are enlightened and progressive enough, you can actually do a board diagnostic, and there are ready tools for you to do that. So again, in the handout that Losop helped me to circulate, you can see like a buffet spread of things that NCSS has put in place. Really, this is actually our new scheme going forward, recognizing that board capability building is actually important. We have funding support and non-funding support as well. So do reach out to us and we will give you the necessary assistance, right? Another new thing that I have kind of started is also bringing a good pipeline of HR leaders for the non-profit space. And these HR leaders are very willing to actually contribute their knowledge and experience. So where you can actually tap on them are really helping you with HR projects that involves, hiring C-suite, review pay structure, job evaluation, redesign your HR policies, even setting up your structures if you are a relatively new charity. And if you have no idea how to set up a grievance handling process, they will be able to assist you in that area. And how to handle, complaints against the CEO, for example. Board succession planning, they can also be very good mentor, very good coach, etc. So come to us if you need any of the help to find your next CEO, your next chairman, any board members, or hiring leaders at any level, tap on our scheme.
Thanks, Joyce. I think one of the questions as I initially mentioned about the role of the board, right? I think staying on this topic of the board, one of the questions from our audience members is that could the panel advise on how to deal with board members who overstep their role and involve themselves in management and operations? Maybe Joyce and then Jukin as well, you can just give your views on this.
I have never been a board chairman before. so I don't know how to manage dynamics. You can get more help if you attend S-Group program. But actually what I have kind of heard as I participated in many of the forums, right? Actually, chairman plays a very, very important role on knowing when to intervene. How do you actually moderate dynamics in your board? And if there are actually dynamics issue between the board and the management, so the chairman will have to have the know-how to mitigate all this situation and be able to, perhaps, I don't know, bring aside, some of these stronger personalities, and to have a word with them to help them understand as well whether they are aligned with the overall cause of the SSA, and hopefully they will change for the better. And, maybe speak to some mentors and coach that could help board members as well. Yeah, and if really the alignment is not there, then unfortunately, this is one of the biggest challenge, right? Then we will have to kind of maybe, excuse the person from the board. It's just like how we manage, non-performers in the organization as well. So these are actually tough conversations that leaders perhaps will have to, brave yourself up to do.
Well, I think one of the challenges that I do see is that actually usually it's the chairman that is the strong man, and he's the one sometimes interfering with management and deciding that, what is this CEO doing? I should be the one taking over and running the whole show. In those kind of situations, of course, it will be very, very tricky because how to go to the chairman to say that you are actually the problem. Okay, the board is overstepping because you're leading the board to make executive decisions and to actually usurp the role of the CEO and not allowing the CEO to do what is good for the organization. I think in those circumstances, if the board has actually is properly structured, like with the audit committee, this is where you could go to the audit committee and bring it up, whether it's the CEO or somebody, one of the key management staff, could bring it up as an appeal to them to say that you have to reassess how the board is functioning and that, it is actually tried law that the board is not supposed to run the day-to-day matters for the company, even in a normal for-profit organization. Now, the other trick I probably would suggest is that go and tell the chairman or whoever is trying to overstep to say that by doing so, while you think that you're helping the organization, but do you not realize that you are actually taking on liabilities that you would not have to take on? And if there should be anything that is wrong, the board can't protect you because you have overstepped, and therefore you become personally responsible for those decisions. As a board member, this is precisely your role: oversight, guidance, strategic direction. So maybe appeal to that person to go back to the very original purpose of him being on the board, so that there is always a separation of power and responsibility. And it's also much easier for the organization to defend itself to say that, look, if the CEO has taken a certain view and the board has independently of him decided that that is the way to go, I think as a board, you have every right to say that I've done my best, I've done my due diligence.
Thank you, Joaquin. A couple of other questions regarding the board. I think this seems to be a very popular topic for our audience members. The first question is about assuming a board member is also a paid staff or an employee, right? So an executive director, basically, but is not the CEO. Should the board member then be excused from all discussions relating to HR matters?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Why don't you go first?
Okay. I think, yes, I would say that unless it is so important for a person to be, part of that process of, I assume that the person who asked this question is thinking about the sensitivity, the confidentiality of each other's pay, and also, if you are a board member, but yet you could actually just be of the same level of seniority as somebody sitting next to you, why should you be, assessing or even determining? I think there's a place for that person to actually recuse himself from the discussion and deliberation. In fact, that's the reason why we have, in a for-profit organization, definitely, a remuneration committee. this committee actually, in fact, I have seen in some companies, and I think that it can apply equally to a charity, where the remuneration committee receives information that the rest of the board members do not receive. And once they have determined what would be the pay grade, what would be the assessment in terms of the bonuses, the assessment for bonus, then they will bring it up before the entire board to say, this is what we are recommending. Would the board please, let us know? And of course, if it comes to sensitive situations like what the question is about, then I think the person should be asked to excuse himself just for that one or two items. But in most cases, you don't see that everybody is conflicted out such that you got nobody to make a decision. Yeah.
Maybe just to add on, it is really aligned with what Joaquin has mentioned. So at all times, to avoid conflict of interest is actually very important, because this will then assure that the system is a fair one and a transparent one. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. Maybe just another question for you then on the role of the board. We have a lot of questions coming in for the board. Is it correct for a CEO to inform staff not to approach and talk to board members? I think going back to your initial point, about the board playing a strategic role, right? Oversight and strategy, including when it comes to working with HR for talent strategy. Is this correct even for the CEO to say, right? Because obviously the board has oversight, not just over management, but also over the day-to-day, right, of the company and the staff, right, especially the HR function. So can you speak a little bit about, can a CEO tell his people not to even talk to board members?
I think this is a very, very tricky question. First and foremost, the clarity of where the line is drawn between the board and the management must be one that is clearly spelled out, clearly communicate to the board members, and clearly communicated with the management as well, right? So top to bottom, everyone should be clear about where the line is. And to be very honest, some of these board members are long enough in the organization. Some of these staff are also long timers. It's difficult to tell them not to speak, but to speak on what issues will then matter a lot. So then fall back to this role clarity, where who actually makes the decision, who actually makes the call. So that has to be clear to both sides. Talking to people on social context, I don't think we will want to stop any of this, because it's also about relationship building. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Before we move on to other questions, there's a lot of questions coming in. Let's just formally do the process of moving into the Q&A section. So thank you very much, Joaquin and Joyce, for your very informative and engaging discussion. So, okay, let's formally move into the Q&A section. As a reminder to our audience, you can still submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So again, sticking to the same topic of the board members, I think, or the role of the board, I think, Joyce, you mentioned previously, and Joaquin as well, both of you touched on this topic about, the previous question about the board members or the chairman overstepping their role, right? So we have a related question for this, is how do you then deal with a toxic chairman, and who should determine if the chairman then should leave the organization? Who is the person who has to have that discussion? Maybe Joyce, you can go ahead, and then Joaquin can take over as well.
If I hear correctly, you're talking about the question asking how to deal with a toxic chairman.
Yes, correct.
Again, very sensitive question. So I would think that there is a formal process like an AGM, election and all. And, it's clear that, if the chairman himself is dysfunctional, whether the board members can then, come together to think for themselves who would be, whether the existing chairman should continue to stay or to go. And if there is, a need, to find the next better chairman, can they find it within the board member, the panel of the board members themselves? Will someone be already, being groomed to take over? Will that person be ready to take over? Or, do you need other help? CMPL also has this board matching where they have, a pool of ready leaders who are, prepared to lead as a chairman. You can also come to NCSS for help. I mean, there are resources where you can seek help from, speak to people who will be able to give you good advice, but it has to be a collective decision within the board itself. What will be the best way forward?
I think in theory, it's easy to say, okay, we can do this, we can do that. But in real practice, Joyce, I'm sure you have come across a lot of such situation where you can say all you want, you can put the best policies and procedures on it. You can say that I'm going to boot that chairman out at the next AGM, but practically speaking, there are many challenges. What if the chairman really is the founder of the charity and everybody in Singapore and in the world looks at him as the icon for the charity? How are you going to move him out? It could spell, disaster for the organization itself. I guess, over time, we hope that every organization of this nature will cultivate a sense of transparency, fairness, and reasonableness. Personalities will always be there. Some people may think that, speaking in a loud tone is bad and that it cannot be acceptable, but people may say this is quite normal. What's wrong with that, right? But bottom line is, let's get down to, is he doing something that ultimately is a question of style, but it does not harm the organization, or it actually does cause a lot of harmful effects to the organization, including, for example, no one wants to continue working for the organization. I think in those kind of situations, we need ombudsman. Do you have one within the organization? Is there an audit committee chairman who is strong enough or who is actually level-headed enough to say, chairman, we need to talk? Or if you do not have that, then it's in other words, even the board members are not able to control him, then would it be something which maybe, even NCSS will actually step in and try to mediate? Can the organization actually go for mediation if it's affecting the operation, the normal operation of the charity? We don't like all these things to be publicized, etc. But sometimes to save the organization, we need to go that step. But otherwise, try to manage it within the resources that you have, within the people that are available to try to manage the situation.
I also remember that there is a term for all the board members, right? It's governed by charity unit. The term should not be more than 10 years. All right, so there will be some guidelines to help mitigate how long can the person stay within the board to contribute. And the other one that I've also mentioned just now, which is actually a very progressive tool to really understand, what your organization needs. Where are the strengths of the board today? Where are the skills that are lacking? You might need to call for a change in the board compositions where you bring in people with the right skill set in order to bring the organization to the next level. In the sector today, we are talking about transformation, digitalization. It can't be a case where the sector are progressing and one or two SSAs are lagging behind. Nobody wants that. Think for the good of the clients. Think for the good of the organization. Then make the decision, what is the best way forward? I think we have a lot of questions along this kind of context, and the response will likely be the same.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. I think, like what you mentioned, there's a few questions on this context, right, about succession planning. I wanted to just maybe go into detail about one of the questions, which is how to motivate a CEO of a nonprofit to actually plan for succession, right? We're talking about succession planning. How do you actually do it? How do you get the onboarding, right, or the open-mindedness from your CEO and the executive management in terms of this is an important issue and we should actually look at this and think about this instead of just talking about it, right? So the question here is, is having a contractual term limit, right, for your CEO, so not your board members but your management or your CEO, is having a contractual term limit of any benefit? This person has worked in SSAs for many years, planned succession planning, but many times the management leadership has changed their minds and then the plans get basically shelved, right, or disrupted. And and proper succession planning or thinking about this never then happens. So what would your recommendation be, Joyce, in this case, to actually get people to think properly about succession planning?
So here I am hearing a situation where succession planning was not very well supported, you know, and my perspective would then be actually succession planning is very, very important. If today the senior management are all in the age range of like 60 plus, 70 plus, actually you think long-term for the organization. Is this good? Is this healthy? Again, I point back, what is best for the organization? That will be actually a very compelling impetus to do the right thing. Then do you have a powerful, you know, competent board to support that? You know, many a times, you know, the nomination com, the HR com, you know, and the audit. I mean, these are actually risks. I will see all this as HR risks, very real risks. How do you mitigate all this risks if you don't have a good succession planning in place? So the board can come in to say, yeah, I need to find a successor. Is it from within? Is it from outside? What is the time horizon? I think these are what I call the tough questions to ask, and they are necessary for the good of the organization.
Well, I guess the organization can also consider hard coding it if it's really so difficult for, you know, the board to sit down, or even for the nominating committee to even, you know, raise this topic. Because in certain circumstances, the key man, the chairman, is so strong a character that it makes it even difficult to raise this topic. I guess if organizations right from the start hard code it, whether even in your constitution, bylaws, or equivalent, it will force people to address that topic. It's not because they bring it up because they hate the chairman or they try to take over his position, but really because it's required as a matter of process that they need to address the topic, and make it difficult for someone to sit in that position for years without having to justify why he's still sitting at that position and functioning as chairman or even as a CEO. But CEO is a little bit more tricky because you need to consider who is going to be the next, because it is really a full-time job. It is not just someone coming in to do it, you know, maybe 10 hours a month. It is actually a full-time job. So I guess there are many ways of dealing with the issue, but it is not a straightforward answer for every organization. It really depends on what is the makeup of the committee and the board in the first place.
Yeah, and also to add, right, I've seen agencies that are quite enlightened and progressive, not just succession planning for the organization, but also the board. I've seen board, you know, term being 2 years, and they will either renew or they will bring in new people. Similarly, for a CEO, maybe it is a 5-year horizon, and then they will change. So different agency, different needs, you know, you will have to be a collective leadership decision.
Thank you, Joyce, Jukin. Maybe let's move on to a whole range of questions about the second theme that we talked about, which is grievances, investigations, complaints. So I think the first question, Jukin, for you should be relatively simple, where basically, okay, so if a charity is aware that a criminal offense has apparently been committed against a staff member in the course of work, for example, a sexual offense, is the charity responsible for reporting the offense to the police, even if the victim employee does not wish to do so? I think this is, especially with recently the whole NUS situation as well, right? This seems to be, a very sensitive, but also a very important topic that we talk about, right? When does the duty to report criminal conduct happen?
I think to start off with, I think the employee himself or herself can actually make the report directly to the regulators or to the authorities or even to the police, especially when you talk about sexual things related to sexual offenses. As an organization, I would say that the minute it is very clear that there has actually been an offense committed, I think a responsible organization, whether it's compulsory or not, will need to make that report. In fact, should encourage the employee to make a report. Sometimes the challenge is that the employee himself or herself refuses to actually do anything about it because of whatever reason. It could be just being embarrassed by the whole thing and not wanting to get anybody in trouble. So what is important, therefore, is to have a set of guidelines, very clear guidelines as to when this thing should be escalated upwards and therefore handed over to the police for investigation. I would say that when there's an offense, yes, the organization do have a responsibility. And I think it is also very important that I think we did touch a little bit about it. Grievances must be seen to have been addressed, not hidden under the carpet. Okay, even if, let's say, you're not talking about grievances relating to something that is as extreme as an offense, whatever it is, you do not also want the employee to go out to the media, especially in today's context. It's so easy for anyone to put up, in the social media, a whole list of complaints about organization. It actually becomes even more difficult to handle.
Yeah, thank you, Joo Kim, for that. I think staying on this whole theme about grievances and complaints and investigations, right? So we have another question about, I think also we touched on this a little bit in the previous discussion, but so the question is, if there's a clear conflict of interest, right, coming from a board member or HR chair, where can the whistleblower go to externally, right? If the chairman doesn't want to take action or the board members don't want to take action against this fellow board member or fellow, executive management, should the complaint then, at least for charities, should the complaint then be made to the Commissioner of Charities or NCSS, or who would you go to?
My understanding is actually they can actually go to the charity unit to lodge a case, for a more formal investigation to be done.
Okay, then the next question also related to this point about grievances and handling of complaints is how should the HR deal with complaints against the executive director of the organization? So I guess we're talking about a person who is dual hatting, right? Both a member of the board as well as a member of the executive management. I think, Joo Kim, you mentioned previously about, and Joyce also, you touched on the fact that conflict of interest is a very, very important point, right, to have in mind and to be aware of as you're doing your investigation process. But I would love to hear from yourself, Joo Kim, as well as Joyce, in terms of specific to this matter, right? Going into a bit more detail about conflict of interest, what should be done?
I think in the first place, when in drafting out policy procedures, HR policies on how conflicts of interest should be dealt with, I think they should include a scenario like this, because it is not uncommon at all. There are many situations that could happen in life, and there are bound to be situations where a lot of stakeholders within the organization would like to cover up, would like to try to keep it under wraps, so as not to them is for the common good, so-called, of the organization. But if a set of policy that is being spelled out and it gives everybody notice that in the event that nothing is being done, they could seek certain external help, and who are they? And in fact, a good organization will ensure that there's somebody external to look at this. Then it'll be a good opportunity to try to. In fact, from my perspective, I think that is actually a better way of managing the situation and not let it blow up out of proportion out in the public. If you are talking about this topic 20 years ago, I would say that, well, you can easily keep it under wraps. Just keep it quiet. How many people will have access to a reporter, and how many reporters want to report on every single topic of this nature? But today, everybody is technically a journalist. You can be a journalist anytime. Just open an account, and you said it enough, somebody pick it up, it becomes blown up. Right? So I think the key is that having the right policies, having the right procedures, it would be very important. Having the right people to handle it, and envisaging the most extreme situation, that there may be a situation where everybody is conflicted. What then you would actually suggest the employee could do? Because if the employee has no help at all, it could very well end up as a complaint to whether it's a ministry or even a complaint just to the Commissioner of Charities.
I would like to just add on that from HR's perspective, right, there's always this declaration process. So you have to be very clear about the scenario and then put in those declarations. I just give one scenario, all right? So we do, interviewing process, to bring in talents, for the Sunray scheme. So we do put in declaration process where the panel of the interviewers will have to declare to us, in fact, days in advance, whether you know any of these candidates. If so, actually, we will find another interviewer to assess the leadership potential of the candidate that we want to bring into the scheme. So this is one example. There will be many examples where there will be, conflict of interest, and how do you define them? How do you make a declaration process, and how do you avoid? So this whole process has to be fair. It has to be transparent. Like what Joaquin say, everything that you do in an organization, every HR practices can become a media focus, if you are not careful in handling.
Yeah. In fact, Joyce, you brought up a very interesting point about declaration. Even one of the practice could be that every year you have a questionnaire given out to all staff, and in confidential, on a very confidential basis. That means, in other words, assure them that the questionnaire will be filled up and handed over to a third party outside of this organization. Now, of course, that means cost, but sometimes, it is a necessary cost where they could actually confidentially put in things which they couldn't say in front of everybody, and then let that be handled by the external party together with the board to say that, look, you have evidence of this guy saying that there's been abuse of powers all these months, but nobody is listening. Then what do we do as an organization? I think I would like to believe that every board member who will volunteer their services on a charitable organization and they don't gain anything more than, being part of an organization that is doing good, I don't think that they would want to go to the extreme of covering up everything when they know obviously there is a problem.
Thanks, Joyce, Joaquin. Maybe let's address some of the questions, just a couple of questions, I think, from the first issue that we discussed, right? The first theme, which is talent attraction, retention, development, right? So we have one of these questions, which is that if our staff want to take an additional work, want to do additional work outside of our organization to supplement their income, especially in today's world, I think we have some people who do side hustles, right? So what are the good considerations to have in mind when responding on whether to accept or deny their request? For example, do we limit the number of hours that they can, do this outside work? And then the second part of this question is, what happens if they get injured while doing their side hustle, right? Is the primary employer or the charity or NPO in this case responsible, right, for workplace injury, or is this even considered a workplace injury matter? Maybe Joaquin, you can start off with some of the legal points, and then Joyce, you can come in with a bit more of an HR perspective on this.
Well, I have to make an assumption first that this is actually a full-time employee of their charity. So in other words, it's not a freelance or even close to a volunteer. So he or she is fully employed by the charity. In most cases, when we have an employment contract, the expectation is that they will devote all their working hours to the organization. Any exception like this, where you allow them to work outside, and hopefully it is actually encoded in your policies, is that they have to first seek permission before going out. And this is a chance where the organization can think through that even if you're going to give the permission for this guy or this employee to actually take on additional work, because the charity recognizes that they do not have enough funds to pay the kind of salary that this person needs for his livelihood. And yes, out of being collaborative, out of taking care of his well-being, you allow him to do so. Then set very clearly the boundaries. When I say boundaries, what are the boundaries? Contractually, you can actually sign a supplemental to say, yes, you can go out to work, but your primary duty will still be to the charity. Because if he's going to focus so much of his energy outside there, he's going to come in half asleep all the time, you're not going to get things done. So there must be understanding, and it should be actually written down. Number two, number of hours, as Sarita you have mentioned, is actually a very good starter. You can't give him the free decision, making power to, okay, today I'll come in, tomorrow I won't come in, according to what he thinks that he's needed outside or inside. Another thing that you probably want to put in writing is actually what would happen if, let's say, there are injuries suffered as a result of the employee working in the other job. Now, I think the law is very clear that if he's not doing work for the organization cannot be responsible for the injuries caused by his other job, especially when the other one is actually also a proper paying job where he has a contract with the other employer. But what is actually tricky is that he gets injured in the other job, but he can't turn up for work anymore at the organization. Now, do you regard that as automatically that he has to take medical leave? And would it count within, the confines of what medical leave that he's being allocated, 14 days, for example, the hospitalization leave, 60 days, or he has to take no pay leave because it is not because of the company that he is not able to attend to his work here. These are things these are hard questions that we need to address, and these are things we should either put it as part of the policies of allowing people to double heads in terms of employment, or put it into a supplemental agreement to the contract. A lot of organizations, they think that, I'll just trust you. But very often when it comes to problems, the lack of something in writing makes it difficult, even more difficult to address.
I think Joachim has given a very comprehensive response to this question. Where I will add in is, really we have such a formal process in our system where you will have to seek permission first before you commit to, outside work employment, all right? And it has to be a formal process of seeking for permission. Things that we look out for is when we do the evaluation, are there any conflict of interest? Will we cannibalize interests of your core job versus the external job? Then also the part on compensation. Are you being paid when you do this? Some of the external activities is really part of national service, especially if you are the domain expert and you are being invited by the tertiary institution to come and do a guest speaking, component. Are you being paid? How much can you accept? So as HR, you have to internalize all this, set a cap. How much of the allowances can the person draw from this assignment? And also like what you say, it shouldn't affect the work. So most of the time, people who are taking on external assignment, you either have to take your personal time, like weekends or after work hours, or take your own leave to fulfill those aspects of work. So at the end of the day, when we pay, for full-time workers to do exceptional job, they should not be distracted by other responsibilities. However, such things will also be assessed case by case.
Thank you, Joyce. Maybe just one very last question. I think this was the question that previously when our audience members signed up, right, or registered for the webinar, there was a whole range of questions relating to this point about talent retention, talent attraction, right? So, and performance management, how do you pay competitive salaries? How do you give a very challenging work environment, right, to attract people? So maybe Joyce, can you just in just a couple of minutes, I think we need to kind of conclude already. Just a couple of minutes, can you just give us a brief sense of what you think some of the best practices are in terms of performance management, and paying competitive salaries or giving something else, right? If you can't pay at the same level as for-profit organizations, just because of the fact that SSAs or MPOs are meant to, you're not for-profit, right? So you're not really meant to pay millions of dollars, I guess, because there is a community service involved. So what are the other ways or the alternatives then you can do instead of just paying high salaries?
Okay, I will just quickly mention that for the part on talent attraction and retention, I've covered quite extensively just now. And I'll just summarize. The key point is, what is your unique selling point? All right. And then whether you are actually creating a human experience within your organization, are there job growth? Are there progression? If it cannot be fulfilled within your organization, are you prepared to exploit creative solutions to work, collaborate with other SSAs, maybe in the same subsector, to have that talent exchange program? You need to know first and foremost, what your people want. What do they look out for? Why do they join you and why do they leave you? You need to have those data to help make decisions on what should be the HR practice. And on the notion of performance management, sorry to say, the biggest challenge is always how to manage out the non-performance. Because in this space that we are in, right, is a lot of time people join us because they have a big heart. They felt, compelled with the social causes and all. They join us because they have pay cut. My question to you is, what skills do you need in your organization? How are you grooming your people? What are those talents that you need to help you do a better job today to bring the organization to the next level? If the answer is good performance is important, then you have to have, a PRP system in place, perhaps, to have a formal process to manage out people who are not performing. And despite months of actually helping the person to perform, you're still unable to bring the person to a good performance level. There is this three months kind of thing where you have to spell out clearly what are the key deliverables for this person. And you have to track performance very closely. All this process has to be clearly documented. After max of 9 months, if the person show no, attitude or no capacity to improve, then sorry, the person has to go. And like I mentioned earlier on, leaders have to make tough decisions. It's not just HR. It has to be a collective effort to manage out people who are not suitable and to bring in people who are capable and can do a better job for the organization.
Yeah. In fact, I would add one point, and that's really that an organization today needs to be progressive. They need to move forward. The whole new environment that has been created by COVID-19 has already changed the landscape for talent hunt. The younger generation, they no longer accept an organization that insists that they must go back to work physically in the office 100% of the time, or rather every working day. I think working from home has become a norm, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. The organization needs to progress with times, need to make it attractive, make it easy for people to adjust to ever-changing circumstances.
Thank you, Joyce Jukin. I was just going to say, that to kind of end off our webinar, right, with some parting kind of words for 30 seconds. But I think both of you have already mentioned, already summarized, I think, the key points, right, the key takeaways. So maybe, maybe I could offer another, maybe 10 seconds, 20 seconds, right, to each of you, if you just want to, if you want our audience members to just take away just one point, right, if nothing else from this whole conversation, what will that be? Maybe we can start with yourself, Joyce, and then we can end with Jukin.
I want to do a big call out to the HR professionals who are in this room. Really, every leader is an HR leader. HR at best is a facilitator and an enabler. You can have the best brand and the EVP, but if your leaders from top to bottom are not living it, then it's actually quite useless. Business transformation cannot happen without people transformation. Are you preparing people for tomorrow? Are they equipped with the right skills? All right. And what is actually your company brand? What is your secret sauce? Are you creating human experience in your organization? And also, there is never a one-size-fits-all kind of people solution. HR, you must do it with your brain. Do it with your heart. Why heart? Heart is really, are you listening with your heart? Are you showing empathy, especially during such time of the pandemic? Whatever you do for the staff, they will remember you deeply. And this is talent retention. And you have to do HR, with guts as well. We have mentioned so much about tough decisions, tough questions to ask. HR, you are the best partner in crime with your CEO. You have to know business. You have to influence the leaders to make the right decision. And don't always start off and end off with the policy says. I think it puts people off. You must have that humanistic approach when you do HR. And you're not alone in this space. There are many companies and even fellow SSAs with good people solutions. So learn from them. So make NCSS, in fact, you can also make me your best friend. If there are any solutions or challenges in terms of finding leaders or finding board, do tap on us on all these things. Final call out is HR professionals, you are doing a very awesome job. You must take care of yourself. If you don't, nobody will. So don't shortchange yourself. You have to constantly upskill and reskill to stay relevant. There is this IHRP certification that I strongly recommend all HR folks to go to. And take care of yourself. Don't die on the job. Self-care is important. Thank you.
Right. Well, I think I can't say anything more. I think Joyce has summed it up so well. And I only say one thing that, you know, in a lot of private for-profit organization, unfortunately, HR is always seen as a cost center, a border. Why you keep asking me about my staff, you know? But I think whether it's a for-profit or especially in a non-profit and especially in a charitable organization, HR I would describe as the backbone of the entire organization, because you are really bringing everything together, because the whole organization depends on human resource, the volunteers, the donors, the beneficiaries. You need to make sure that everybody is actually working together to serve the community, the constituency. And so, as Joyce said, you know, please don't shortchange yourself. Always see yourself as very critical and important in the entire organization. And don't be shy about asking hard questions. Sometimes it's difficult to bring the questions up, but ask hard questions. Because at the end of it, when you save the organization from a lot of pain, a lot of unnecessary costs, then people will realize how important that one question that you asked, you know, had actually contributed to the organization. Sarita.
Thank you, Joaquin, Joyce. We must bring our session to a close, but to the audience members, please remember to scan the QR code. It's on the top left-hand corner of the slide on the screen right now to access the handouts. Like what Joyce mentioned, they are very important, very useful handouts that are made available for this webinar. And just on a final note, before we close off, we are pleased to announce that we will have a communities of practice workshop to go into more details about employment matters within charities on the 25th of October from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. In this workshop, we will discuss deeper, right, on the issues of talent attraction, retention, development, grievance management, effective involvement of the board in a charity or NPO. You will receive the link to register for this communities of practice workshop in the follow-up email that will be sent tomorrow. Please keep an eye out and register for it because spaces are limited, so it is first come, first serve as well. With that, we'll bring this webinar to a close. When this webinar ends, to our audience members, there will be a feedback form that will appear on your screen, on your browser, for you to complete. We would greatly appreciate if you could take a few minutes to complete the form so that we can improve our webinars for you. Thank you so much, Joaquin, Joyce, all our audience members for joining us today, and have a pleasant week ahead. Take care and keep well.
Thank you.